Question B from Improving Performance asks students to explain the coach's considerations when dealing with an overtrained athlete, and we're looking here at 5 marks. Some key parts of this question students need to be aware of is obviously the key term, explain. We need to look at the coach's considerations when they are dealing with an overtrained athlete. So the question's not asking us to look at the symptoms of an overtrained athlete, but what are some of the things the coach needs to do when they have an athlete that is overtrained? How could they make some changes? How could they deal with that? It's worth 5 marks. If we go to our syllabus dot point or syllabus, we can have a look and see where we're going to come in. It's going to be planning to avoid overtraining. We're looking at the amount of intensity of training, physiological considerations, psychological considerations. That's the part there of our syllabus we need to emphasise for this question. Right, remembering that if we go back to the question, what students need to look at is how they're dealing with an athlete that's overtrained. Okay, so first of all here we look at this answer. We're going to notice that again it's pretty poorly set out. Some considerations that need to be taken for an overtrained athlete are their sleeping patterns, ability to focus, because an overtrained athlete will not be getting enough sleep, meaning that they won't be able to focus, for example. So it's not really talking about how to deal, it's more along the lines straight away looking at some symptoms. What causes overtraining? Sleeping patterns, ability to focus. Right, as it goes further down, it talks about another consideration. We go over the page and we look at the physiological well-being. Being overtrained can be a cause of depression, which will affect performance and self-motivation. This is exemplified by James, a football player who is usually the first one at the field ready to play, usually pumped up because he's overtrained, he's unmotivated. So again, we're more focused on some of the symptoms, how could you identify an athlete that's overtrained, as opposed to what the question, if we come back to the question again, what it was asking us to do, explain the coach's considerations when dealing with an overtrained athlete. So we already know that the athlete's overtrained, we already know that they're going to be lethargic, they're going to be tired, they're going to be lack motivation, can't concentrate, all those things. We don't need to repeat that. What we need to look at is how we would deal with the situation. And because of the way the athlete or this student's answered this question, that's why it's only been given a 3 out of 5. It hasn't really answered the question in the way that it needed to be. Compared to the next sample question we've got here, again we have a look at the response that's been given. Some things that I like straight away what I notice. First of all is the dot point that relates to it, which we saw earlier on, is being underlined and is being demonstrated here at the top of the answer. We go through it. A coach has many considerations when dealing with an overtrained athlete, whereby a few factors contribute to this occurring. The amount and intensity of training currently occurring must be considered. Where if too frequent and too intense, athletes may be negatively affected. Hence, coaches should modify this to a moderate level. So comparing the two answers straight away, we've seen that this student hasn't gone through and spoke about the symptoms of someone who's overtrained, but instead realised that in regards to the amount and intensity of training, the syllabus dot point from up here, how can this be changed? What could the coach do when dealing with it? He might need to modify and gives an example to support it. That's what the question's asking us to do. We go further down. The physiological considerations are also important, as the athlete's body and general well-being must be monitored by the coach. In the occurrence of lethargy, an athlete's long-term well-being comes into question as they are tired, whereby a further development of this is the creating of an injury being sustained. So we're starting to look at things which we need to fix up in terms of the training program, which the coaches needed to do. All right, so that's why that so far there is a much better answer. Okay, because it's looking at the parts of the question which is asking dealing with an athlete that's overtrained. Okay, psychological considerations must also be held from the coach's perspective, as a lack of motivation can develop an athlete over time if they are subject to overtraining. All right, so how can we deal with that? I reckon this part here is why the students only really got a 4 out of 5, because they haven't come back. This is more along the lines of symptoms. They need to look at how could the coach deal with this. And that's what would have given the student probably a 5 out of 5. But again, the setting out, the underlining, the highlighting is outstanding, makes it look very good. That's what all students need to be aiming to achieve. We just go to some of the marking guidelines. There it is there for this question. Talks about our syllabus dot points and also some examples of ways to deal with an overtrained athlete. There's a number of them there. All right, gradual increase to exercise program over time, an eating balanced diet, adequate hydration, environmental considerations, recovery time, monitoring physiological changes, considerations of lifestyle. So there's a number of factors there that go on. The feedback from this question for all students. This question required students to explain the considerations for a coach with an overtrained athlete, i.e. strategies to deal with overtrained athletes. Most students were able to apply their knowledge well to this question and provided a clear relationship between the reasons behind an overtrained athlete, physiological versus psychological symptoms versus amount intensive training, and the ways or strategies to deal with an overtrained athlete, example, varieties on training, exercise activities. Unfortunately, some students only discussed the ways to identify an overtrained athlete, which is what we saw with our first sample answer, and failed to identify the strategy to employ to deal with such an athlete. Remembering, if we come back to our question, what our question said to us was, explain the coach's considerations when dealing with an overtrained athlete. What would they need to do for an overtrained athlete? And that's exactly what our feedback is saying, is that, again, I'll read it for you. Some students only discussed the ways to identify an overtrained athlete and failed to identify the strategy to employ to deal with such an athlete. It was more along the lines of how do you deal with an overtrained athlete as opposed to what are some of the symptoms of an overtrained athlete.